Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorgen. I'm here with London Paul. And Paul is kind of fascinating because on Friday we did our own podcast on the early parts and trying to make some thoughts and speculations and just put together what was going on in Syria. And within 3 days, everything we had talked about was thrown by the wayside. With that being said, we're going to try to take a look today at events that happened, some of the aftermath, and just this is a fascinating event in history, something so fast you would think it was the blitzkrieg of Germany on France. Paul, I want to thank you as always for being part of this great discussion. And what are your first initial thoughts here in regards to this sudden, complete overthrow of the Syrian government?
Well, firstly, thanks as well for joining me today, Ken. As ever, it's a pleasure when we get together. And yeah, you're right. We recorded something to put it out over the weekend. And to be honest, by Saturday, it would started to look like there's no point putting this out. And by Sunday, it was clearly obvious it wasn't any point in doing so because while parts of it were correct, we made, the discussion and how we phrased it just was no longer appropriate because I'm sure, as everyone knows, Assad is no longer president and it ends a family sort of association with the leadership of Syria for 5 decades. And frankly, it happened so quickly. And in some ways, it's a bit of a surprise because you got to bear in mind all the back history starting in 2011 with this fake Syrian civil war to get rid of Assad. And at one point, sort of 2014 to early 2015, it looked like he might end up, no longer being the president. Then obviously the Russians got involved to a significant extent. So did more so the Iranians as well. And also Hezbollah, and then the rest was history. And it completely changed the fortunes of the war. And what we've seen in basically 11 days is from what seemed like not innocuous, but initially the HTS made this incursion out of Idlib, and we'll talk about that whole issue of Idlib shortly, and ended up in Aleppo. And within a matter of days, they'd taken over huge swathes of the country effectively. And Assad was gone, and he's gone, and his family and him have been given political asylum in Russia, perhaps unsurprisingly. Don't think there's many places he could have gone to. I mean, certainly nowhere in Europe, nowhere in the West, as it were, certainly nowhere in West Asia. And ironically, the Chinese wouldn't either. But I think the comment that came out of the Russians, and it was Putin who made that agreement, was we always look after our friends. So undoubtedly, that's what's come to pass. The only thing I would say is, in regards to that, it wasn't that long ago that Assad went to Russia. Maybe we have to view that meeting in a different context. But I thought what we should do first, Ken, is I don't want to go into too much of the history because, excuse me, there's huge amounts of it. But I think the one thing that was worth mentioning, and this is kind of ties in a little bit with Ukraine, and that's this frozen conflict kind of syndrome, which the West is trying to implement in Ukraine. It won't be allowed to happen by the Russians. But effectively, this is what happened in northwest Syria, in Idlib region. And there was a meeting in early March of 2020 between Erdogan and Putin in Moscow. And they basically drafted this treaty to cease all military actions along the line of contact in what is the Idlib de-escalation area. And that started basically at midnight on the 6th of March 2020. And part of it is, at that point, Turkey said they were hosting 3.5 million Syrian refugees. They couldn't take any more. And what Ankara wanted to do was basically pause Assad forces so they couldn't, launch a major offensive in that province. And it pulled them back to lines agreed, which was ironically a 2018 deal with Russia that was brokered at that time in Sochi. Now, subsequently, of course, we had this freeze in that area for years, and then suddenly out of Idlib came all these, and we'll use the term uh, basically moderate rebels. I know that's not reality, but it's best on channels like this to say moderate rebels. Everyone knows what it means. And suddenly they broke out of Idlib, seemed to be very well armed. And, they had access to drones, more advanced technology. And I think effectively it appears to a large extent that Syria had fallen asleep and become complacent and didn't really think there was going to ever be a problem again. So they started this offensive against government forces in northern Syria. Very rapidly, they seemed to take Aleppo, and it looked at one point as though the Syrian forces were moving to the outskirts, sucking them in rather like what the Russians do with Ukrainians. But then very quickly, they just evaporated and started heading south. And they were then in Hama, and then they left Hama, then eventually they left Homs. And in the end, these so-called moderate rebels took Damascus, and it was over. And Assad was gone, and he didn't put up any resistance. He just left. He was allowed to leave clearly, which I think is an appropriate way to deal with these things. At least that much is a positive. And this group basically is HTS, which is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is a splinter group of Al-Qaeda. So this Astana agreement was a big mistake because the ceasefire, which effectively was between Syria and Turkish-occupied Idlib, I think turned out in some ways to be rather like the Minsk agreements, because Syria in 2018, 2019 could have easily, I think, taken Idlib. They didn't. And of course, what happened is this deal was signed, and there's no doubt this assisted Turkey in some ways to deal with the problem of Kurdish element, which threatened Turkey, and Turkish forces in Idlib were present. But this Astana agreement effectively prevented Assad taking back Idlib and the withdrawal of the Turkish forces from Syria. And, and I think there was also fear that, we could have had Turkish forces coming up against Russian forces, and that's a bit of a kind of NATO country against Russia. Okay, and it is technically could have been an Article 5, but of course it never came to pass. And during the intervening years, the argument is who's responsible for arming and financing and training these moderate rebels and preparing them for the day when they could launch another offensive with this advanced weaponry, and including drones. So effectively now the Astana agreement's dead in the water. I mean, the question is, okay, there's numerous countries being accused of being part of this. Turkey, obviously the United States and Israel. I mean, and it's difficult to know what the initial purpose of this was, because what I will say is I've heard 10 different versions of this from people, credible people, from people who are, in Syria, people who are kind of have all said no one's really sure what happened. There was a feeling, if you go back, that Erdogan wanted rapprochement with Assad. Assad refused. Well, okay, that's his choice. And then there was a sort of claims that basically what happened is these moderate rebels were supposed to be sent into Aleppo to put the frighteners on Assad, who then would have to get to the negotiating table and talk about a different Syria in the future. And it kind of got a bit out of hand, and they just basically then started taking city after city, marching further south. Okay, the Russians were providing aerial bombardment, and a lot of these moderate rebels were killed, but claim is there could have been upwards of 30,000 of them. And of course, in that regard, the rest history, as we said, because Assad's gone. And of course, then there's a big question: where are we now? What's going to happen in the future? And just to put some context on this, it's kind of ironic that HTS split from Al Qaeda in 2016. And since 2018, it was designated a foreign terrorist group by the US State Department. But I mean, and it was certainly active very quickly, and going from Aleppo in the north down to Damascus in the south. And also, clearly, even though there was a frozen conflict going on, intelligence should have been aware of this build-up inside Idlib, which apparently no one was, or if they were, no one said anything. And I can't believe the Syrians weren't aware of it. But there are claims that really since the frozen conflict, the Syrians didn't do anything militarily. They didn't put any fortifications in anywhere, take any precautions. Didn't, they basically, because they were hamstrung with sanctions, didn't really have a huge amount of money, didn't bolster their military, and were in no position to deal with any kind of offensive that subsequently happened. And I think partly you have to say that because they backed away, the Syrians, then, okay, there was the Russian aerial bombardment. But apart from that, no one else wanted to get involved because their attitude is, well, if you yourself don't want to fight the war, why should we fight a war for you? Of course, there was the meeting in Doha between Turkey, Iran, and Russia. No one knows precisely what was discussed there, but in essence, that meant the writing was on the wall for Assad and it was time to go. Although I think the argument is that there was time to go quite a bit before that. There are claims that countries like Iran had started to lose patience with him. I think maybe, and this is speculation totally, that countries had started to go, look, you've reached the end of the line as a president. There's a desire to modernize Syria. Now, of course, this is a huge question. And this is something we will discuss as to what's going to happen in the future, because Syria is a hugely complicated problem, not least because it effectively involves Iraq and not just Syria, obviously, Iran, Turkey. It involves Lebanon. It involves Israel, the United States, and Russia. And also elements like the Kurdish elements in northeastern Syria, the Kurds in Idlib, and a whole bunch of problematic situations that, countries like Russia are involved in, the United States is as well, and Turkey. So this is immensely more difficult to predict what the outcome is going to be, but we wanted to just provide initially some background to give people an understanding as to what some of the context was, and how it's relevant to what's happening today, because this does prove freezing conflicts doesn't end a war. All it does is means at some point in the future, it's going to thaw out and there's going to be another resurgence in something. And this has clearly happened in Syria.
Yeah, one of the things that really has stood out is over the past 5 to 10 years, we've started seeing a lot of old religious hatreds go away. We see Saudi Arabia and Iran, Sunni and Shia, coming together, casting aside the old ancient differences that go back centuries, if not a millennia, to create and form partnerships and such. Syria is just recently brought back into the fold. They were outcast and ostracized by the Arab League for so long. And one of the things that I heard way back in the day is that Bashir really didn't want to lead a country. I mean, he was a dentist until his father passed away. And then he took, was thrust in there, took over the country. I don't think he ever, one, wanted to do it. And two, he doesn't have the fortitude to be a leader of a country. And so in many ways, the military, the way it reacted over the past week or so, not having the will to fight, is just a mirror or a microcosm of its leader, Assad, who himself didn't want to lead. And so Syria, for the most part, has been ripe for the taking any time. And, obviously, intelligence services across the West, they know this. And they just waited for that ceasefire to take place in Lebanon. And boom, instantaneously, it's Syria time. And I can fully understand Russia's side of it is, you know what? We are there to act as a complement to our partners. We're not there to fight your wars. And if if your own military doesn't have the will to fight, we're not going to lose our men, trying to save your bacon. And instead, you know what? The chips fell where they may.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an important point to make. You make the context correctly that, there's been this move for rapprochement with Syria, putting them back in the Arab League, rapprochement between even Saudi and Syria. And I get the feeling there was some expectation that this was leading to an idea that at some point, Assad's going to step down, and then this more perceived, a more moderate kind of government. Okay, I know there's people who disagree with that, there's people who agree, but we're only expressing what this context might mean from the perspective of regional players. So it partly was, well, we're starting to, cut you some slack. And I think then this idea from Erdogan that you need to be part of drawing you back into the world order, as it were, and having you as a partner we can have normalized relations with, meaning Turkey and Syria. And of course, Assad refused on a couple of occasions, maybe more. And I think at that point, there's an argument that says, well, there was an idea, look, you've overstayed your welcome. It's time to move on. Now, I'm not suggesting this should have happened or it should have been allowed to happen. We're just saying this appears to be in part what's happened. I think what's telling, though, if you go to this Doha meeting, apart from Turkey and Russia and Iran, who were like part of the Astana agreement, there was also quite a lot of the West Asian countries there. The one thing that stands out to me, there was no Western representation whatsoever. So you kind of get the feeling some decisions were made. We won't know at this point precisely what they are, but it kind of suggests to me that Assad was kind of coming to, perceived to be, look, it's time to move on. We need some fresh blood in this country. Now, of course, trying to necessarily use moderate rebels to achieve that aim is disastrous. It might not, of course, even be ultimately the aim, because there's always the idea that Erdogan has designs on an Ottoman Empire again and might want to seize parts of Syria, and we'll talk in detail all the players and the problems that we're likely to see in the future. But in a way, it was never one of these situations where there was like a color revolution and they organized massive protests in Damascus or anywhere else, and then some event happened and Assad was removed from power. It wasn't even like that. There weren't these massive protests. Now, I'm not saying everyone liked Assad, but I've always made the point, for Assad to have survived this long, he needed the support of the people and the support of the army. Now, it could be that the army's just been so badly mismanaged, and there was claims that a lot of the army numbers were just numbers on paper. They didn't really have a military force capable of defending the country. So there are many sort of permutations to this problem, but absolutely what's clear is that that there was no way the military could defend the country. And okay, it remains to be seen what happens, and we'll start to talk about this in a subsequent what I call almost like part 2 of what's going on. And what we've already seen. And there's some very interesting developments which we'll put in what I would term part 2. And I think that's something obviously we need to reflect upon. Now, of course, it's a very fluid situation and things could change rather dramatically. And we have to be extremely careful we don't make assumptions that turn out to be nonsensical. But I think it was very obvious that when the Russians granted Assad asylum and he went there, I would suspect when Assad went to Russia recently, it might have been he'd already agreed with that. And when you look, in the event of something, I come here and be given asylum? And he will, of course, have been told, yes, absolutely. And, clearly decisions like that aren't made except by Putin himself. I mean, and of course, he had close relations with the Iranians and the Russians. There are claims the Iranians were getting fed up with Assad, but that's debatable, and often it's Western sources. And so we have to be very careful as to how we interpret that. What is very clear now, there is extreme instability in Syria. And of course, there's the issue, what happens to the Russian bases? And we'll talk about that subsequently. What's very clear is Russia is in intense dialogue with Turkey, another regional state, with respect to Syria. I mean, so the question is obviously what happens going forward. But I think this introduction gives people some context, some perspective, because this is a massive problem. It dwarfs the problems and the difficulties, and they're big enough that you see in Ukraine and in with respect to Gaza and obviously Lebanon stroke Hezbollah. So I think, Ken, that's probably a good point to stop with this one, and then we'll go into more detail in the next one as to why it's hugely significant and all the players and some of the developments we're seeing now, which may offer some degree of encouragement, but you have to be extremely careful and not be complacent, because it really is a huge hot potato that's potentially could unfold in Syria in the coming weeks and months.
Yeah, in my closing comments here, I opened the podcast with a comparison to Germany and France in World War II and Blitzkrieg. France relied upon the Maginot Line, and once that was passed, they had no will to fight, and they were done in 45 days. Russia relied upon the integrity of the Minsk agreement. That fell by the wayside, so they had to take things into their own hands. And then we see this with Syria. If you rely too much on agreements going back to 2016, 2018, 2020, and do nothing about it, then all it does is open up, you're seen as weak, and very quickly you can fall, as we have seen in Syria. Paul, I want to thank you as always for being a part of this great discussion and for your insight.
And likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you very much for all of your support. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, comment, send this out to anybody you think might be important. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.